Christmas is coming, and I will be alone this year. So please leave a Christmas greeting that will warm my heart in the comments. Okay, let's go. The Christmas stranger. It all started when Ellie insisted we rent a cabin for Christmas. She wanted something different, a snowy retreat to escape the noise of the city. At first, I thought it was a great idea. A week away in the mountains, just the two of us sounded perfect. We arrived late in the afternoon on Christmas Eve, the snow already piling up around the winding road. The cabin was charming in an old-world way, with its rustic beams and stone chimney. It felt secluded but inviting, nestled deep in the forest like something out of a storybook. Ellie had spent weeks preparing for the trip. She strung lights around the small tree in the corner and laid out a feast on the wooden table. We ate, laughed, and settled by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and sharing memories. It felt magical. The first sign that something was wrong came around 10 p.m. Ellie was in the kitchen cleaning up when she called out, "Hey, did you close the shutters?" I frowned, looking up from the book I was reading. "No, why?" She appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "They're closed now? I didn't touch them." A chill crept over me. "Maybe it was the wind," I said, though the explanation sounded weak even to me. We brushed it off and went to bed, the warmth of the fireplace easing my unease. At some point in the night, I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but the deliberate, measured pace suggested otherwise. I nudged Ellie awake. "Did you hear that?" She groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. "It's probably nothing. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin. I got up quietly, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay here," I whispered. I crept to the front door, my heart pounding. When I peeked through the peephole, the porch was empty. "See anything?" Ellie whispered behind me, making me jump. "No," I said, though my voice wavered. We stayed up for a while, but the footsteps didn't return, and eventually exhaustion won out. The next morning we found tracks in the snow, large boot prints leading up to the porch and then disappearing into the woods. "We should call someone," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "There's no signal out here," I reminded her, showing her my useless phone. We decided to stay close to the cabin for the day. The snow was falling heavily now, and the isolation that had seemed so appealing suddenly felt oppressive. That night, as we sat by the fire, the knock came. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "Who would come out here in this weather?" Ellie whispered. I approached the door cautiously, the fire poker clutched in my hand. "Who's there?" I called. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. "Maybe it's someone who needs help," Ellie said, though she didn't sound convinced. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. A man stood on the porch, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were old-fashioned, a tattered coat and boots caked with snow. "Evening," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm lost. Mind if I come in to warm up?" Everything about him screamed danger, but the storm was raging, and Ellie gave me a pleading look. Reluctantly, I stepped aside. The man entered, his presence filling the small space. He stood by the fire, his back to us, silent except for the occasional crackle of his boots on the wooden floor. "Where are you coming from?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just passing through," he replied, his tone clipped. Ellie offered him a cup of tea, but he declined, his gaze fixed on the flames. Something about him was deeply unsettling. His eyes, when they met mine, were too dark, like bottomless pits. And his smile, it wasn't friendly, it was predatory. As the night wore on, the tension in the room grew unbearable. Finally, Ellie whispered, "I think he should go." I nodded, clearing my throat. "The storm's letting up. You should be able to make it to town." The man turned to us slowly, his smile widening. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." Before I could react, the lights flickered and went out. The fire died instantly, plunging the cabin into darkness. Ellie screamed, and I grabbed her, backing away from the man who now loomed impossibly tall in the shadows. "Thank you for letting me in," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "It makes things much easier." The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the room itself were alive and suffocating us. Ellie clutched my arm, sobbing. "What do you want?" I demanded, though my voice shook. The man's face contorted, his features stretching and warping until he was no longer human. His eyes burned like coals, and his mouth twisted into a jagged, gaping maw. "You invited me," he growled, his voice reverberating through the cabin. The walls began to shake, and a deafening roar filled the air. Shadows crawled across the floor, reaching for us with claw-like fingers. I grabbed Ellie and ran for the bedroom, slamming the door shut and shoving the dresser in front of it. "What is he?" Ellie whispered, her face pale with terror. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're not staying to find out." We climbed out the window into the freezing snow, the storm howling around us. Behind us, the cabin glowed with an eerie red light, and the man's laughter echoed in the night. We didn't stop running until we reached the road, where a passing snowplow driver found us and took us to safety. The cabin burned down that night, though no cause was ever determined. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But every Christmas, I can still feel his eyes watching, waiting, just beyond the light. Haunting melody. I never thought Christmas could feel so hollow. This year, my wife Emily and I decided to escape the chaos of the city and spend the holidays at her late grandmother's estate, a sprawling old Victorian house nestled deep in the countryside. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, a chance to reconnect, but from the moment we arrived, the air around the house felt wrong. The house itself was breathtaking but eerie. Its towering gables and dark windows loomed like watchful eyes. The heavy snow only added to its isolation. Emily had loved this place as a child, though she admitted her grandmother used to tell her strange stories about the house being special. I thought it was just an old woman's imagination. The first night was uneventful, save for the faint creaking of the house settling. I chalked it up to its age and the chill of winter. Emily and I spent the evening decorating the ancient Christmas tree in the parlour, a family heirloom adorned with antique ornaments that had seen better days. But on the second night, something happened that I can't explain. It began with the music. At around midnight, as I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard faint singing. The melody was unfamiliar, haunting yet strangely beautiful. At first, I thought it was Emily playing a record downstairs. But when I turned to wake her, she was fast asleep beside me. I sat up, listening. The singing grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the house. It was outside. Against my better judgment, I crept to the bedroom window. The snow outside sparkled under the moonlight, unbroken except for a single set of footprints leading away from the house and into the woods. My stomach tightened. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned. "What's wrong? Do you hear that?" She sat up, rubbing her eyes. The singing was fainter now, almost as if it were retreating. It sounds like a choir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "But there's no one out here." We stared at each other, the unease between us growing. Neither of us mentioned the footprints. The next morning, I searched the yard, but the snow was pristine. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Emily tried to laugh it off, suggesting we might have been dreaming. I wanted to believe her, but the memory of that melody lingered, worming its way into my mind. That evening, as we prepared dinner, we heard it again. This time, it was closer. Emily froze mid-chop, her eyes wide. "It's the same song," she whispered. I nodded, trying to stay calm. "Let's just ignore it." But the singing didn't stop. It grew louder, filling the house with an unearthly harmony. The air turned frigid, our breaths visible as we stood frozen in the kitchen. The lights flickered, then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Emily to follow me. We huddled in the living room, the weak beam of light barely cutting through the shadows. The singing was all around us now, as if the house itself were humming with it. Then, the ornaments on the Christmas tree began to sway. At first, I thought it was a draft, but the sway turned into a violent shake. One by one, the baubles fell, shattering on the floor. Emily screamed, and I instinctively pulled her back as the tree collapsed with a deafening crash. "Get your coat!" I barked, my voice trembling. "We're leaving!" We hurried to the front door, but as I reached for the handle, the singing stopped. The silence was deafening, heavier than any sound. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. And then, the knocking began. It was slow and deliberate, each knock echoing through the house. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was upstairs. "Don't go," Emily pleaded, clutching my arm. But something compelled me to move. Against her protests, I climbed the stairs, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The knocking grew louder as I approached the master bedroom. My heart pounded, my breath shallow. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the darkened room. At first, I saw nothing. But then, in the corner, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its face obscured, but its eyes, they glowed with an unnatural light, piercing and unrelenting. It raised a hand, pointing to the window. And outside, in the snow-covered yard, stood a choir of figures dressed in tattered robes. They were singing, their mouths impossibly wide, their voices carrying a dissonance that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. "We need to leave, now." Emily didn't argue. We grabbed our coats and ran to the car. The engine sputtered to life, and as we sped down the icy road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was dark, its windows lifeless. But in the yard, the choir remained, their song fading into the distance. We never returned to that house. Emily refused to speak about what we saw, and I couldn't blame her. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that haunting melody again, and I wonder if they're still singing, waiting for us to come back. The shadow at the window. It was a few days before Christmas when my girlfriend Natalie convinced me to spend a weekend at her family's old hunting cabin deep in the woods. She had fond memories of it from her childhood, and I wanted to make her happy, so I reluctantly agreed. The drive was long and cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones no matter how high you crank the heat. The cabin was quaint, rustic she called it, but to me it felt desolate. It stood alone, surrounded by towering pines, with a thin layer of snow blanketing the ground. The first night passed uneventfully. We lit a fire, drank hot chocolate, and tried to ignore the creaks and groans of the old wooden structure. The isolation was unnerving, but Natalie was happy, so I kept my discomfort to myself. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. We had just finished dinner and were sitting on the couch, wrapped in blankets and watching the flames dance in the fireplace. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. That's when we heard it. A faint knock at the window. I froze. Did you hear that? Natalie nodded, her face pale. It's probably just a branch, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Then the knock came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate taps, like knuckles on glass. We both turned to look at the window. Through the frost, I could see nothing but darkness. Stay here, I said, grabbing the flashlight from the table. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. I shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no branches that could have hit the window. Just the silence of the woods and the crunch of snow under my boots. When I went back inside, Natalie was sitting stiffly on the couch. Did you see anything? She asked. No. Probably just the wind, I lied. That night, we went to bed uneasy. The wind continued to howl, and the cabin seemed to settle into an even deeper silence. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the window rattling. I nudged Natalie awake, and we both listened. Then, from somewhere in the cabin, we heard slow, deliberate footsteps. Is someone inside? Natalie whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept into the living room. The fire had gone out, leaving the room shrouded in shadows. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on us. I turned to go back to the bedroom, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing outside the window. It was tall and dark, its features obscured by the frost, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the night. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Natalie, I whispered, backing toward the bedroom. Don't look. But it was too late. She had followed me into the living room, and when she saw the figure, she let out a small, strangled scream. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us through the glass. Then, without warning, the window shattered. We ran back to the bedroom and locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the poker. For hours, we sat in the dark, listening to the sound of something moving through the cabin. Heavy footsteps, doors creaking open and slamming shut. A low, guttural sound that didn't quite resemble a growl or a human voice. At some point, it stopped. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, we cautiously opened the bedroom door. The cabin was a wreck. Furniture had been overturned, the kitchen table was broken in half, and the shattered window let in a freezing draft. But the worst part was the marks on the walls, long, deep scratches that looked like they had been made by claws. We packed our things and left without looking back. On the drive home, Natalie was quiet, her face pale and her hands trembling. Christmas nightmare. Last year, my husband Greg and I decided to rent an old farmhouse for Christmas. It was the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. Snow-covered hills, a winding dirt road, and a cozy, rustic vibe. It was perfect for the quiet holiday retreat Greg kept talking about, and I was desperate for a break from the chaos of the city. The house had been built in the late 1800s, and while it had been updated enough to be comfortable, it still carried a sense of its age. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls were lined with antique portraits of unsmiling faces. Greg loved it. He called it authentic. I thought it was eerie. We arrived a week before Christmas, the snow already knee-deep. The first couple of days were peaceful. Greg built fires in the stone hearth while I baked cookies and read by the window. It felt idyllic, like a step back in time. But then the nights began to change. The first strange thing happened on December 22nd. We were sitting by the fire, sipping mulled wine, when there was a knock at the door. It was odd. Our closest neighbours were miles away, and we hadn't seen another soul since arriving. Greg stood up. Who could that be? I followed him to the door, a chill running through me. When he opened it, no one was there. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, untouched except for our own footprints from earlier in the day. Greg shrugged it off. Must have been the wind knocking a branch against the door. I wasn't so sure. That night, I woke up to the sound of laughter. It was faint but unmistakable. A high-pitched giggle, like children playing. I nudged Greg awake. Did you hear that? He groaned, pulling the blankets over his head. It's just the wind, Laura. Go back to sleep. But the laughter continued, now joined by the sound of running footsteps. I got out of bed and peered out the frosted window. In the moonlight, I could see faint impressions in the snow outside. Small footprints leading away from the house and into the woods. The next morning, Greg found me standing by the window, staring at the now covered tracks. You're imagining things, he said, laughing. This place is just getting to you. But I knew what I'd seen and what I'd heard. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, the power went out. Perfect, Greg muttered, lighting a couple of candles. Romantic, right? I wasn't in the mood for romance. The house felt oppressive, like it was closing in around us. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of wind against the windows made my nerves jump. And then came the banging. It started softly, like someone tapping on the walls. But it grew louder, more insistent, coming from every side of the house. Greg grabbed a flashlight. Probably an animal. Stay here, I'll check it out. Don't go out there, I pleaded, but he ignored me, heading into the freezing night. He returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. Nothing, not even a raccoon. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, every sound magnified in the stillness. On Christmas Eve, the house became a nightmare. It started with the voices. We were in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie, when we heard it. A soft, lilting hum, like someone singing a lullaby. Greg muted the TV. Did you hear that? I nodded, my heart pounding. The humming grew louder, joined by faint whispers. The sound was coming from upstairs. Greg grabbed the flashlight again. Stay here. No way, I said, following close behind him. We crept up the narrow staircase, the whispers growing clearer with every step. They weren't in English, something older, guttural, almost like chanting. When we reached the top, the sound stopped. Greg pushed open the door to the guest bedroom. The room was empty, but the air was icy cold, our breath visible in the dim light. Then the giggle came again. We spun around and I swear, for just a moment, I saw them. 3 small figures standing at the end of the hallway, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes black as coal. And then they were gone. We ran downstairs, locking every door and window, though I doubted it would help. That night, as we lay in bed, the banging returned, louder and more furious than before. The voices echoed through the house, the singing and chanting blending into a cacophony of sound. And then, silence. It was almost worse than the noise. Greg and I barely slept, and as soon as dawn broke on Christmas morning, we packed our things and left. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house. Standing in the upstairs window were 3 small figures, watching us go. We never spoke about what happened, and Greg refuses to even acknowledge it now. But I know what I saw, what I heard. And every Christmas since, I've woken up to the faint sound of giggling no matter where I am. The Yule Horror. It started as a cozy holiday getaway, just me and my fiancée Eleanor in a secluded lodge up north. She'd found the place online, a small, picturesque cabin nestled deep in the snowy woods. It had a roaring fireplace, an old-world charm, and most importantly, no Wi-Fi or cell service. A proper Christmas unplugged, she'd said with a smile, and I couldn't say no to her enthusiasm. The drive was long, the last stretch winding through dense pines where the snow seemed to smother all sound. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the pristine white ground. The cabin was just as charming as advertised, with a wreath hanging on the door and wood stacked neatly beside the porch. The first day was perfect. We decorated a tiny tree, drank hot cocoa, and exchanged early presents by the fire. It felt like a postcard come to life. But that night, as the wind howled outside, I woke to a faint sound, distant yet sharp. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then it came again, scraping. I nudged Eleanor awake. "Did you hear that?" She groaned, half asleep. "It's just the wind." I wasn't so sure. The sound was deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. I got up and peeked out the window. The porch was empty, just a smooth expanse of snow glowing faintly in the moonlight. The next morning I found them, scratches on the wooden beams of the porch, long and deep, as though something with claws had been trying to get in. Eleanor laughed it off. "Probably an animal," she said, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. That evening, as we were making dinner, we heard footsteps, slow and heavy, on the porch. Eleanor froze, the knife clattering onto the counter. "Maybe it's a deer," I said, though I didn't believe it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but swirling snow. Yet the footsteps in the snow were fresh, leading up to the door, and stopping there. The prints weren't like any I'd seen before. They were elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I shut the door and bolted it, my heart racing. That night, the sounds came again. Scraping, followed by faint tapping on the windows. The cabin had 3, and the tapping moved from one to the next, as though something, or someone, was circling, trying to find a way in. We huddled together on the couch, every light in the cabin blazing. "What if someone's out there?" Eleanor whispered. "Then they're staying out there," I replied, gripping the fire poker like a lifeline. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. Around midnight, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, the fire casting flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. And then we heard it. A low, guttural voice, so close it seemed to come from the walls themselves. It spoke in a language I didn't recognize, the words guttural and alien, each syllable sending a shiver down my spine. Eleanor clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's inside," she whispered. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I knew she was right. The voice wasn't muffled like it should have been if it were outside. It was clear, resonant, and far too close. We retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind us. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and then laughter. Not human laughter. It was a distorted cackle, as if 100 voices were laughing in unison, each one slightly out of sync with the others. The door rattled violently, and then the handle began to turn. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her toward the window. "We're leaving," I said, my voice trembling. We climbed out into the freezing night, the snow biting at our skin as we stumbled toward the car. The laughter followed us, echoing through the trees, accompanied by a series of thudding footsteps that seemed impossibly fast. When we reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I finally managed to start the engine, and as the headlights flared to life, they illuminated something standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with elongated limbs and a face that was almost human but wrong in every way. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth, and its eyes burned with a malevolent light. It took a single step toward us, and I slammed on the gas. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, too scared to sleep. The next day, we returned to the cabin with the property manager. There was no sign of what we'd seen, no footprints, no scratches, no broken door. It was as if nothing had happened. But we know what we saw. And every Christmas since, I can't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see those burning eyes staring back at me. The Last Noel. Christmas was always my favorite time of year. The lights, the music, the food, everything felt magical. This year, though, I needed an escape. The holidays were tainted by a bad breakup and the sudden realization that I'd been avoiding myself for too long. So when my childhood friend Mark invited me to spend Christmas with him and his fiancée in their remote mountain cabin, I jumped at the chance. "It'll be just the 3 of us," he promised over the phone. Quiet, simple, and far from everything. The drive up was treacherous. Snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the winding mountain roads. By the time I arrived, the cabin looked like something out of a postcard. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm glow of light spilled through the frosted windows. "Glad you made it," Mark said, pulling me into a bear hug. His fiancée, Lisa, was just as welcoming, offering me a steaming mug of cocoa the moment I walked through the door. The cabin was cozy, rustic but well kept. The centerpiece was a towering Christmas tree adorned with ornaments that looked older than I was. A small hand-carved nativity set sat on the mantel, and stockings hung neatly above the fireplace. We spent the first evening laughing and catching up. By the time we turned in, I felt lighter than I had in months. But that night, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't the creak of the cabin settling or the wind howling outside. It was a faint melody, like someone humming a Christmas carol just out of earshot. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound seemed to come from the living room. Grabbing my phone for light, I crept down the hall. The living room was empty, the fire reduced to embers. But the Christmas tree lights were blinking erratically, casting distorted shadows on the walls. I froze when I noticed the nativity set. The figures had been rearranged. The shepherds and wise men were turned away from the manger, their faces eerily pointed toward the window. A shiver ran down my spine, but I convinced myself it was a prank. Mark and Lisa's idea of a joke. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I asked them about it over breakfast. "You're kidding, right?" Mark said, frowning. Lisa shook her head. "We didn't touch the nativity. Are you sure you weren't sleepwalking or something?" I laughed it off, but the unease lingered. That afternoon, the storm worsened. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind shrieked like a living thing. Mark and Lisa busied themselves baking cookies while I wandered the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until dinner that things escalated. We were sitting around the table, the storm howling outside, when the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of the fireplace. Mark grabbed a flashlight. "I'll check the breaker." "I'll come with you," I offered, more out of fear than helpfulness. We found the breaker box in the basement. Mark flipped the switches, but nothing happened. "Must be the storm," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. As we climbed back upstairs, I stopped cold. There, in the middle of the living room, stood the nativity set. "How?" Mark started, but Lisa's scream cut him off. We rushed into the kitchen to find her staring at the window. Outside, illuminated by the pale moonlight, were footprints. Bare, human footprints leading away from the house into the woods. "Who the hell is out there barefoot in this weather?" Mark whispered, his face pale. The three of us huddled together, staring out the window. The prints led straight to the tree line, where the shadows seemed to writhe unnaturally. Then the humming started again, louder this time. It came from inside the cabin. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered back to life, casting the room in a sickly, pulsating glow. The ornaments swayed as if disturbed by an invisible hand. "Get the car keys," Mark said, his voice tight. "We're leaving." But when Lisa turned to grab her coat, the front door slammed shut, followed by the deafening sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, grabbing a fire poker. The humming grew louder, filling the room. It was a Christmas carol, but distorted, like a record playing at the wrong speed. Then we saw it. A figure stood by the tree, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. Its long skeletal hands reached out, plucking ornaments from the branches and crushing them one by one. "Get out!" Mark yelled, swinging the poker. The figure turned its head slowly, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, just a black void where eyes and a mouth should have been. The room plunged into chaos. The windows shattered inward, and the wind roared through the cabin, carrying with it the scent of pine and decay. Lisa screamed as the figure advanced, its hollow gaze fixed on her. Mark swung the poker wildly, but it passed through the entity as if it weren't there. Desperate, I grabbed the nativity set from the floor and hurled it at the figure. The moment the figurine shattered, the entity let out a bone-chilling scream and vanished. The wind died down, and the lights returned, casting the cabin in an eerie calm. None of us spoke as we packed our things and left, the storm raging behind us. We never found out what it was or why it came, but I'll never forget that face, or the way it hummed that broken melody, echoing in my mind long after we escaped. The Unseen Christmas Guest. Last Christmas, my wife Clara and I decided to spend the holiday at a secluded cabin deep in the Colorado Rockies. We wanted to escape the noise of the city and enjoy a quiet, snowy retreat. The cabin belonged to Clara's friend, who assured us it was cozy and well-equipped for a winter getaway. It was picturesque, a wooden structure nestled among towering pines, with snow blanketing everything in sight. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional howl of the wind. For the first couple of days, it was perfect. We roasted marshmallows by the fire, drank hot cocoa, and marveled at the untouched beauty of the forest. But on Christmas Eve, things began to feel off. It started with the footsteps. I was outside chopping wood when I heard them, light, crunching steps in the snow behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Clara, but there was no one there. The woods were still, the snow untouched. "Clara!" I called out, my voice echoing. No answer. I shook it off, blaming my imagination. But that night, as we settled in by the fire, Clara asked, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" She glanced toward the front door. It sounded like someone walking on the porch. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The cold bit at my skin as I scanned the empty porch. The snow was undisturbed, no footprints leading to or from the cabin. "Nobody's here," I said, closing the door behind me. Clara frowned. "I could have sworn." We tried to brush it off and went to bed early, planning to wake up refreshed for Christmas morning. But sleep didn't come easily. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. "Clara," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Did you lock the door?" "What?" "Yes, of course," she mumbled, still half asleep. But the sound of the door swinging shut jolted her fully awake. We both sat up, hearts pounding. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the bedside table. I crept into the living room, my bare feet freezing against the wooden floor. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. I closed the door and locked it again, checking the windows for good measure. When I returned to the bedroom, Clara was sitting up, her eyes wide. "Something was here," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard it breathing. It was in the room." I froze. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the corner near the dresser. "I don't know. I couldn't see it, but I felt it watching me." I tried to reassure her, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. "It's probably just the wind playing tricks on us." But deep down, I knew this was more than that. On Christmas morning, we woke up to a disturbing sight. The once pristine snow outside the cabin was covered in long claw-like marks, as if something had dragged itself through the yard. Clara gasped. "What could have done this?" "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "But we're not sticking around to find out." We decided to pack up and leave immediately, but as we were loading the car, Clara suddenly stopped, staring at the cabin's front window. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" "There was a face." I looked, but saw nothing. Still, her fear was contagious, and I hurried to finish loading our things. Just as I climbed into the driver's seat, we heard it, the sound of jingling bells. But this wasn't the cheerful sound of Christmas sleigh bells. It was slower, heavier, almost menacing. Clara grabbed my arm. "Drive, now!" I didn't need convincing. I floored the gas pedal, the tires skidding briefly before gaining traction. As we sped down the snowy road, Clara let out a gasp. "Don't look back," she said, her voice shaking, but I couldn't help myself. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, a dark, hulking figure standing in the middle of the road behind us. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its antlers stretched unnaturally wide, casting long shadows in the moonlight. The jingling bells grew fainter as we put more distance between us and the cabin. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. When we told the locals what had happened, their faces turned grim. "You're lucky to be alive," one of them said. "The mountains have their own kind of spirits. and not all of them are friendly. We never went back to that cabin, and Clara's friend refused to speak about it when we asked her later. To this day, the sound of jingling bells sends a chill down my spine, because I know they don't always herald something merry. Sometimes they're a warning to run. The silent carols. When my sister Maggie suggested renting a cabin in the woods for Christmas, I thought it was a brilliant idea. It was a chance to break away from the chaos of city life and spend some quality time with family. Maggie's husband, Kevin, and their teenage son, Jake, would join us. It was supposed to be a peaceful holiday, full of snowball fights, cozy fires, and plenty of eggnog. The cabin was a gem, nestled deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It was decorated for the holidays, complete with garlands, a massive Christmas tree, and twinkling lights strung across the porch. The first couple of days were everything we'd hoped for. We built snowmen, roasted marshmallows, and even went sledding down a hill nearby. On Christmas Eve, the snow started falling heavily, blanketing the forest in a quiet, serene beauty. That evening, as we settled in for hot cocoa and a movie, the first strange thing happened. We were all sitting in the living room when the sound of bells echoed through the cabin. Not the cheerful jingling of sleigh bells, but a low, somber tolling. "Church bells?" Kevin asked, looking puzzled. "In the middle of the forest?" Maggie said, frowning. We all glanced at each other, unease settling over the room. Jake got up and peered out the window. "Nothing out there," he said, but his voice wavered. We decided to brush it off, blaming it on the storm and the acoustics of the woods. But later that night, as we all prepared for bed, the bells returned. Louder this time. I couldn't sleep. The sound echoed in my head, growing fainter but more insistent. I got up and crept to the living room, drawn to the sound. The Christmas tree lights flickered as if reacting to some unseen force. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and gaunt, passed through the window. It moved too quickly to be human, almost gliding across the snow. My heart pounded as I backed away, stumbling into a side table. The noise must have startled it, because the shadow froze before darting toward the edge of the woods. The bells stopped. The next morning, I told the others what I'd seen. Maggie laughed nervously, saying it was probably a trick of the light. Kevin joked that I'd been hitting the eggnog too hard. Jake, however, didn't laugh. "I heard footsteps outside my window last night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was one of you." We all exchanged uneasy glances but decided to carry on with our Christmas plans. We spent the day opening presents, playing games, and eating far too much. The memory of the bells and the shadow seemed distant by midday. But that night, everything changed. We were gathered in the living room again, playing a board game, when the bells started tolling. This time they were deafening, shaking the very walls of the cabin. The lights flickered violently, and the fire in the hearth dimmed to a faint glow. "What the hell is going on?" Kevin shouted, jumping to his feet. Before anyone could answer, there was a loud knock at the door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was heavy, deliberate, like someone pounding with a battering ram. Jake screamed, and Maggie grabbed him, pulling him close. Kevin and I exchanged a look, and without a word, he grabbed a poker from the fireplace. I followed him to the door, my heart racing. When we opened it, the night outside was eerily still. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, and the forest was a wall of black. No one was there. "Close it!" Maggie hissed from behind us. Kevin slammed the door shut, But before we could move away, the bell started again, louder than ever. The lights went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Everyone stay together," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. We huddled in the living room, the only light coming from the faint embers in the fireplace. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen. Then the carols began. Soft, mournful singing echoed through the cabin. The words were foreign, sung in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was haunting, each note crawling under my skin. Jake pointed toward the tree, his face pale. "Look." The ornaments on the tree were spinning, faster and faster, as if caught in an invisible wind. The angel topper tilted, its serene face cracking down the middle. And then we saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms barely visible against the night. They surrounded the cabin, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. One of them stepped closer, and I saw its face, sunken and skeletal, with skin stretched impossibly thin. "We need to leave," I whispered. Kevin shook his head. "Not in this storm. We'll freeze before we get to the car." The figures moved closer, their carols growing louder. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard mixed with the cries of the damned. Maggie clutched Jake, tears streaming down her face. "What do they want?" As if in response, the figures stopped singing. The lead figure stepped forward, raising a bony hand to point directly at Jake. "No," Maggie sobbed, shielding her son. Instinct took over. I grabbed the angel topper from the tree and threw it at the figure. It shattered against its chest, and for a moment the creature recoiled. "Fire!" Kevin said suddenly. "Get the fire going!" We scrambled to throw logs and kindling into the fireplace. Kevin struck a match, and the moment the flames roared to life, the figures screamed, a sound that pierced my ears and made my head throb. They retreated, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The bells tolled one final time before everything went silent. We didn't sleep that night. At the first light of dawn, we packed our things and left, abandoning the cabin without looking back. To this day, I can't hear Christmas carols without feeling a chill run down my spine. The memory of those hollow eyes and mournful songs will haunt me forever. The Christmas Watcher. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. There was something magical about the snow, the lights, the crisp scent of pine wafting through the house. This year, my boyfriend Aaron and I decided to spend it away from the chaos of the city in a remote cabin tucked deep in the mountains. It sounded perfect, just the two of us, a roaring fireplace and no distractions. The drive up was peaceful, the snow falling lightly as the car wound its way along the mountain roads. When we arrived, the cabin looked like something out of a winter postcard. Quaint, with a wraparound porch, a fresh blanket of snow on the roof, and a towering evergreen tree in the yard. Inside, it was cozy and warm, with rustic wooden beams and a stone fireplace. We unpacked, decorated the little tree we'd brought along, and settled in for what we thought would be the most relaxing Christmas we'd ever had. That first night was uneventful. We sipped hot chocolate, exchanged small gifts, and played cards by the fire. I went to bed feeling content, unaware that it would be the last peaceful night of the trip. The next morning, as I opened the curtains, I noticed something strange. In the snow just beyond the porch, there was a single set of footprints. "Aaron, come look at this," I called. He joined me, frowning as he examined the tracks. They were large, much larger than a person's, and spaced far apart, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them had taken enormous strides. Maybe it's a bear, he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. A bear walking on 2 legs? I countered. We decided it was probably nothing to worry about. The snow had covered the tracks by midday, and we spent the rest of the day sledding and building a snowman. That night I woke to a strange sound, faint but distinct. It was a low humming, almost like a chant carried on the wind. I sat up, straining to hear. "Aaron," I whispered. He stirred beside me, groggy. "What is it?" "Do you hear that?" He listened for a moment and shook his head. "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The sound continued, growing louder and more rhythmic. It wasn't the wind. I was sure of it. The next morning I found something else. The snowman we'd built was destroyed, its head torn off and thrown several feet away. Around it were more footprints, the same large deliberate tracks as before. Aaron's face darkened when he saw it. "It's probably just kids messing around," he said, but we both knew that was unlikely. The nearest house was miles away. That night, the humming returned, louder this time. I woke Aaron, and we both sat in the dark, listening. "I don't like this," he muttered. Neither did I. Suddenly, there was a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. We jumped out of bed, and Aaron grabbed the fire poker. "Stay here," he ordered, heading for the door. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "Don't go out there." But he didn't listen. He flung the door open, and the icy wind howled inside. He stepped onto the porch, shining a flashlight into the night. "What do you see?" I called, my voice trembling. "Nothing," he replied, though his voice was uneasy. He came back inside and locked the door, his face pale. "I don't know what it is, but we're leaving first thing in the morning." I nodded, relieved, but the morning didn't come fast enough. Around 3 a.m., the humming stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the doorknob rattled. My heart leapt into my throat. Aaron and I froze, staring at the door. "Is it locked?" I whispered. He nodded, gripping the fire poker tightly. The rattling grew more forceful, and then the door creaked, as though something heavy was leaning against it. Aaron motioned for me to stay back as he approached the door. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice firm despite the fear I knew he felt. No response. Then, with a deafening bang, the door shook violently. I screamed, and Aaron jumped back. "It's coming in!" I cried, panic overtaking me. Aaron grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the bedroom. We barricaded the door with the dresser and huddled together, listening as the banging continued. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening. We waited for what felt like hours, our breaths shallow and ragged. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, we ventured out. The front door was wide open, the snow outside trampled and disturbed. In the middle of the yard stood a figure, a tall, shadowy form cloaked in black. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated malice. Aaron grabbed my arm, pulling me back inside. We packed our things in record time and fled the cabin without looking back. To this day, I don't know what we saw, or who, or what was out there in the snow. All I know is that every Christmas, I can still hear the faint hum in the wind, a chilling reminder of the Christmas we almost didn't survive. Thank you for listening. Bloody subscribe. And I wish you a scary Christmas. Good night.